like to welcome our speakers and acknowledge the important work done by the Nursing Registration Board. It's obviously a much more challenging time than it was back in the days when 6 or 7 Irish nursing schools provided all of the graduates and provided enough graduates, and things are very different. And it has to be said, I was involved, having had extensive representations made to me by individual nurses and by their representatives at the time of the proposed increase in the retention fee, that they had a number of concerns which I do think need to be addressed. There is a sense that increasing the fee by 80% over 2 fee cycles in 2 years seemed hard to justify. And in particular, the question that was repeatedly asked was what extra were they getting for the 80% increase in the retention fee over this cycle? And I think it's important that you and the other committee members should know that what a consistent refrain I heard from many nurses was that the board, from their perspective, and I'm not saying I agree with it, appeared to have 2 functions. Number 1, to take their money, and number 2, to discipline them. This was certainly a widespread opinion on the part of the nurses who were registrants in the board. Nurses themselves had felt that they had disproportionately suffered the effects of personal circumstance cutbacks during our recession. They, like everyone else, had USE. Because they were mostly public servants, they'd had sometimes very substantial decreases in pay. Many of them had depended on what had been non-discretionary overtime, which disappeared. And more importantly, many of them felt that they were working much harder. They were working harder because there were fewer replacement posts being filled, people were being allowed to retire, and the increased attention to capping levels of staff within publicly funded institutions meant that they were not seeing their retiring colleagues being replaced. So these were all concerns they had. Many of them felt, where was the Nursing Registration Board when this was going on? What position of public advocacy were they taking? Now, a few specific questions for you. You tell us that you were understaffed, and I accept that. We're well used to anything run by the Irish Public Service is likely to be either understaffed or malstaffed. How many are you understaffed by, and what is the budgetary shortfall to replace the positions which actually would fix them? And relevant to that, and again, I'm not trying to be provocative, but I do feel this is my opportunity to bring points to your attention that were brought to my attention. The nursing members had concerns about how the board's money was spent. They wanted to know how much was being spent on public relations, how much was being spent on travel and other expenses, all of which I'm sure were legitimate, but their questions were there opportunities for cost savings there? At the time, they were wondering, could these cost savings have been passed on with smaller retention fees? But I guess the question I'm asking you is, could the cost savings be passed on by hiring extra staff to process the actual requirements? With respect to your function, you have many Irish graduate nurses who train in medical schools that you're very familiar with. You know all about the schools, you know all about the individuals, they've been with you for many years. It seems to me that the re-registration of somebody who is in that position should be very simple compared to the registration, the credential interrogation of somebody who's coming perhaps from a different continent, from medical school, which may be a very fine institution, but a nursing school rather, I should say, that you're not familiar with. Is there any degree of cross-subsidization of the current expenses? Are the relatively simple registration requirements of Irish and EU trained nurses being used to subsidize the appropriate interrogation of the credentials of folks who are coming from schools which are less well known? Finally, I'd just like to say that I raised this on several occasions when it looked like we were facing a shutdown in the health service on this issue, and many nurses basically said they would not pay the increased fee, and thankfully there was an outbreak of compromise and common sense. The minister at the time gently reproached me and said that I misunderstood the function of the board, that the function of the board was one and one only, to protect the public. And I kind of get that. There is a need to protect the public, but if you're entirely protecting the public, then the public should pay for it. If you're protecting the public and defending the standards of the profession and defending the individuals who are in the profession, then it's appropriate that they should pay some component of it too. And I would just take this opportunity to say one more thing. We have in Ireland a tendency to follow the tombstone principle, which is the principle which is enunciated in the world of air safety. Most of the great air safety organizations wait until a crash has occurred, go back and see what happened, and then investigate, rather than trying to prevent it by going forward. And in the air traffic circles, this is usually seen as an advocacy for telemetry and real-time monitoring of cockpit management, etc. But I get the sense we do the same thing in Ireland. We have a very unsafe health service. We have a health service which, in all of the critical frontline areas, is grotesquely understaffed, where people are overworked, where people are expected to do things which they're sometimes not trained to do at all. And on those circumstances, we will, and we do have a higher frequency of adverse outcomes, of lawsuits, of general quality queries than other equivalently sophisticated health systems would have. And I think it's really critically important, and I've made this point to HICWA as well as I'm now making it to you. It's very important that you need to prospectively wrap the knuckles of the people who hire the nurses, who make the decisions, and to tell them there are problems and they need to fix them, and not to be depending on you to come in as the police force afterwards to investigate people who in difficult circumstances sometimes get outcomes which are not as good as they should be.
In respect to the, and I thank Senator for his questions, in respect to the annual retention fee and the rationale for the fee increase has clearly been well documented over the particular time. The fee was increased on 2 consecutive years due to the historic low cost base that the organisation had been operating on for some time. The fee had been increased, the board had increased the fee, or had proposed a fee increase of €100 in, or €140 in 2013 for 2014, and then given the circumstances, it was the board determined to leave that fee at €100 with the view to increasing the fee in 2014 for the 2015 annual retention process. The rationale for, the reason for the fee was simply the cost of implementing the full new legislation and the subsequent need to modernise the organisation in regard to development of and replacement of old ICT, not towards any sort of highly sophisticated level, but to a level which would allow a modern organisation conduct its business. And so the fee was primarily, as I say, due to the cost of the new legislation over a period of 4 years. And so that cost of the new legislation was just in excess of 8 million over that period of time. The issue in regard to how the organisation and the regulatory body is viewed by those whom we register is of concern. We are mindful of it. It is one of our objectives as we work our way through the implementation of the new legislation and indeed conduct our business, is to create a greater awareness of what it is to be regulated and how regulation can support the individual nurses in advancement in their practice on a daily basis. But the objective, as you say, is the sole objective of the regulatory body is to protect public, to safeguard the public from anybody referring to themselves a nurse who may not have met the competencies or impaired standards. And that is the purpose of that, and we do that through setting of standards for education, continuing professional guidance, and the Code of Professional Conduct. So in that respect, it is public interest through the setting of standards for the nurses and midwives. In respect to value for money and the costs of running the organisation, the Nursing Board, under its new legislation, is very much is part of and comes in under the remit of the Controller and Auditor General, and the Board's accounts have been audited by the CNAG for 2012 and 2013, and had not found any adverse findings to include in this report on the accounts of the public services which he laid before the Houses of the Oireachtas. And for 2014, the accounts have recently been complete, and no matters of substance have emerged during the course of this audit. With respect to the staff costs and the costs to replacing the staff that have left the organisation, the overall cost would be in the region of €500,000. But these were costs that had been budgeted for in the original fee, business case for the original fee of €150. With regard to travel, as Senator would be aware, international work is a routine, normal part of the work of the regulator, and particularly regulators of health professionals, where it is very much a global activity. And the recognition and appreciation of the developments of nursing and midwifery in Ireland is very much recognised right across the world. And in order to sustain that development and apply evidence-based practice to our regulation, it is important that the board continue that international work. The international work and participation in international forums and networks is no different from my predecessors over the years, and indeed it is I'm contractually obliged to carry out this work. And again, as I said, in relation to auditing, all of the travel costs have been audited and are in compliance with department policy. With respect to the tombstone approach, there are three elements, and I appreciate that maybe nurses and midwives don't always see the middle element of what regulation is. The first is the registration. The second is maintaining nurses' competence whilst on the register. And we do that and have done so we've continued to do so in the last 4 years through the launch of a new code of professional conduct and ethical practice. We have recently approved, the board has recently approved a new scope of professional practice for nurses and midwives, which will enable and facilitate greater latitude in the work that nurses and midwives can do. We have revised the practice standards for midwives, and we have our revisions to the undergraduate standards and requirements for education of nurses and midwives is going to the board in the autumn for approval. And we are, in conjunction with the Health Service executive, revising our guidelines for the management of medications, and there is a multidisciplinary forum revising the policy and standards around nurse prescribing. So we do address the professional development of nurses and midwives in that respect. With regard to the your question in respect to the registration and renewal, I'll defer to Ursula, who can provide you with some of the detail around that to explain why it is more complex.
In favour, I am sorry, because I do want to go to the vote. I'm just wondering if you could possibly just, maybe I missed it. The specific question I had was, how much is the public relations spend? How much are the contracts? How much do you spend for public relations?
I can certainly answer that question, given that the communications contract per se is a communications contract which also includes the web restructuring. It incorporated we had a member of staff, because we don't have a full-time communications person, which we needed for a period of 4 months, and an annual retainer. And as I say, the amounts that were budgeted for has been in the region of 300,000. That was for last year. And as I say, so that was the public relations. That's considerably reduced now, this going into the future, because we don't have the staff member there. And the web project will be coming to conclusion at the end of October. In regard to...
May I ask a supplementary on that?
Yes, you vote, yeah, very briefly.
I have to run for the vote. Just, and I'm sorry, because I'm not putting you on the spot, or you may not have all of this at your fingertips, but is it the same company? Because they're very different skill sets that do web and do public relations. Is it the same company doing both for the 300,000?
Contract incorporates the web, and there is a subcontractor then to do the web specifically.
Would you know, and again, you may not know this off the top of your head, how much of that is the web and how much of it is... I'm really interested. It's not just you. I ask everybody this. I've got to be in my bonnet about public bodies spending money on public relations.
The budgeted amount, as I say, remember the project isn't complete yet, for the web development is 80,000.
So it's approx 220 for public relations.
But that budget figure was also inclusive of a staff member for a period of 4 months.
A staff member doing what?
Within the organisation to do the internal and external communications.
So it is public relations. Thank you. Okay.